of Mice and Men.
Disc 3.
George's hands stopped working with the cards. His voice was growing warmer. And we could have a few pigs. I could build a smokehouse like the one Grandpa had, and when we kill a pig, we can smoke the bacon and the hams and make sausage and all like that. And when the salmon run up river, we could catch 100 of 'em and salt 'em down or smoke 'em. We could have 'em for breakfast. Ain't nothing so nice as smoked salmon. When the fruit come in, we could can it. And tomatoes, they're easy to can. Every Sunday we'd kill a chicken or a rabbit. Maybe we'd have a cow or a goat. And the cream is so goddamn thick you gotta cut it with a knife and take it out with a spoon. Lenny watched him with wide eyes, and old Candy watched him too. Lenny said softly, "We could live off the fat of the land." "Sure," said George. "All kinds of vegetables in the garden. And if we want a little whiskey, we can sell a few eggs or something, or some milk. We'd just live there. We'd belong there. There wouldn't be no more running around the country and getting fed by a Jap cook. No, sir. We'd have our own place where we belonged and not sleep in no bunkhouse." "Tell about the house, George," Lenny begged. "Sure. We'd have a little house and a room to ourselves, a little fat iron stove, and in the winter we'd keep a fire going in it. It ain't enough land, so we'd have to work too hard, maybe 6, 7 hours a day. We wouldn't have to buck no barley 11 hours a day, and when we put in a crop, why, we'd be there to take the crop up. We'd know what come of our planting." "And rabbits," Lenny said eagerly. "And I'd take care of 'em." "Tell how I'd do that, George." "Sure. You'd go out in the alfalfa patch, and you'd have a sack. You'd fill up the sack and bring it in and put it in the rabbit cages." "They'd nibble and they'd nibble," said Lenny. "The way they do, I seen 'em." "Every 6 weeks or so," George continued, "them does would throw a litter, so we'd have plenty of rabbits to eat and to sell. And we'd keep a few pigeons to go flying around the windmill like they done when I was a kid." He looked raptly at the wall over Lenny's head. "And it'd be our own. And nobody could can us. If we don't like a guy, we can say, 'Get the hell out.' And by God, he's got to do it. And if a friend come along, why, we'd have an extra bunk, and we'd say, 'Why don't you spend the night?' And by God, he would. We'd have a setter dog and a couple striped cats, but you got to watch out them cats don't get the little rabbits." Lenny breathed hard. "You just let 'em try to get the rabbits. I'll break their goddamn necks. I'll smash 'em with a stick." He subsided, grumbling to himself, threatening the future cats which might dare to disturb the future rabbits. George sat entranced with his own picture. When Candy spoke, they both jumped as though they'd been caught doing something reprehensible. Candy said, "You know where's a place like that?" George was on guard immediately. "Suppose I do." He said, "What's that to you?" "Well, you don't need to tell me where it's at. Might be any place." "Sure," said George. "That's right. You couldn't find it in 100 years. Candy went on excitedly. "How much they want for a place like that?" George watched him suspiciously. "Well, I could get it for $600. The old people that owns it is flat bust, and the old lady needs an operation. Say, what's it to you? You got nothing to do with us." Candy said, "Well, I ain't much good with only one hand. I lost my hand right here on this ranch. That's why they give me a job swamping. And they give me $250 because I lost my hand. And I got 50 more saved up right in the bank right now. There's 300. And I got 50 more coming the end of the month. Tell you what," he leaned forward eagerly, "suppose I went in with you guys. That's $350 I'd put in. I ain't much good, but I could cook and tend the chickens and hoe the garden some. How'd that be?" George half closed his eyes. "I got to think about that. We was always going to do it by ourselves." Candy interrupted him. "I'd make a will and leave my share to you guys in case I kick off, 'cause I ain't got no relatives or nothing. You guys got any money? Maybe we could do it right now." George spat on the floor disgustedly. "We got $10 between us." Then he said thoughtfully, "Look, if me and Lenny work a month and don't spend nothing, we'll have $100. That'd be $450. I bet we could swing her for that. Then you and Lenny could go get her started, and I'd get a job and make up the rest, and you could sell eggs and stuff like that." They fell into a silence. They looked at one another, amazed. This thing they'd never really believed in was coming true. George said reverently, "Jesus Christ, I bet we could swing her." His eyes were full of wonder. "I bet we could swing her," he repeated softly. Candy sat on the edge of his bunk. He scratched the stump of his wrist nervously. "I got hurt 4 years ago," he said. "They'll can me pretty soon. Just as soon as I can't swamp out no bunkhouses, they'll put me on the county. Maybe if I give you guys my money, you'll let me hoe in the garden even after I ain't no good at it. And I'll wash dishes and little chicken stuff like that. But I'll be on our own place, and I'll be let to work on our own place." He said miserably, "You seen what they done to my dog tonight? They says he wasn't no good to himself nor nobody else. When they can me here, I wish somebody'd shoot me. But they won't do nothing like that. I won't have no place to go, and I can't get no more jobs. I'll have $30 more coming time you guys is ready to quit." George stood up. "We'll do her," he said. "We'll fix up that little old place, and we'll go live there." He sat down again. They all sat still, all bemused by the beauty of the thing. Each mind was popped into the future when this lovely thing should come about. George said wonderingly, "Suppose there was a carnival or a circus come to town, or a ball game, or any damn thing." Old Candy nodded in appreciation of the idea. "We'd just go to her," George said. "We wouldn't ask nobody if we could. Just say we'll go to her, and we would. Just milk the cow and sling some grain to the chickens and go to her. And put some grass to the rabbits," Lenny broke in. "I wouldn't never forget to feed them." "When we gonna do it, George?" "In 1 month. Right squack in 1 month. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write to them old people that owns the place that will take it. And Candy'll send $100 to bind her." "Sure will," said Candy. "They got a good stove there?" "Sure. Got a nice stove, burns coal or wood." "I'm going to take my pup," said Lenny. "I bet by Christ he likes it there, by Jesus." Voices were approaching from outside. George said quickly, "Don't tell nobody about it, just the three of us and nobody else. They liable to can us, so we can't make no mistake. Just go on like we was going to buck barley the rest of our lives. Then all of a sudden, some day, we'll go get our pay and scram out of here." Lenny and Candy nodded, and they were grinning with delight. "Don't tell nobody," Lenny said to himself. Candy said, "George?" "Huh?" "I ought to have shot that dog myself, George. I shouldn't ought to have let no stranger shoot my dog." The door opened. Slim came in, followed by Curly and Carlson and Whit. Slim's hands were black with tar, and he was scowling. Curly hung close to his elbow. Curly said, "Well, I didn't mean nothing, Slim. I just asked you." Slim said, "Well, you've been asking me too often. I'm getting goddamn sick of it. If you can't look after your own goddamn wife, what do you expect me to do about it? You lay off of me." "I'm just trying to tell you I didn't mean nothing," said Curly. "I just thought you might have saw her." "Why don't you tell her to stay the hell home where she belongs?" said Carlson. "You let her hang around bunkhouses, and pretty soon you're going to have something on your hands. You won't be able to do nothing about it." Curly whirled on Carlson. "You keep out of this, unless you want to step outside." Carlson laughed. "You goddamn punk," he said. "You tried to throw a scare into Slim, and you couldn't make it stick. Slim throwed a scare into you. You're yellow as a frog belly. I don't care if you're the best welter in the country. You come for me, and I'll kick your goddamn head off." Candy joined the attack with joy. "Glove full of Vaseline," he said disgustedly. Curly glared at him. His eyes slipped on past and lighted on Lenny. And Lenny was still smiling with the delight at the memory of the ranch. Curly stepped over to Lenny like a terrier. "What the hell you laughing at?" Lenny looked blankly at him. "Huh?" Then Curly's rage exploded. "Come on, you big bastard. Get up on your feet. No big son of a bitch gonna laugh at me. I'll show you who's yellow." Lenny looked helplessly at George, and then he got up and tried to retreat. Curly was balanced and poised. He slashed at Lenny with his left, then smashed down his nose with a right. Lenny gave a cry of terror. Blood welled from his nose. "George," he cried. "Make 'em let me alone, George." He backed until he was against the wall, and Curly followed, slugging him in the face. Lenny's hands remained at his sides. He was too frightened to defend himself. George was on his feet, yelling, "Get him, Lenny! Don't let him do it!" Lenny covered his face with his huge paws and bleated with terror. He cried, "Make 'em stop, George!" Then Curly attacked his stomach and cut off his wind. Slim jumped up. "The dirty little rat," he cried. "I'll get him myself." George put out his hand and grabbed Slim. "Wait a minute," he shouted. He cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "Get 'em, Lenny!" Lenny took his hands away from his face and looked about for George, and Curly slashed at his eyes. The big face was covered with blood. George yelled again, "I said get him!" Curly's fist was swinging when Lenny reached for it. The next minute, Curly was flopping like a fish on a line, and his closed fist was lost in Lenny's big hand. George ran down the room. "Let go of him, Lenny. Let go." But Lenny watched in terror the flopping little man whom he held. Blood ran down Lenny's face. One of his eyes was cut and closed. George slapped him in the face again and again, and still Lenny held on to the closed fist. Curly was white and shrunken by now, and his struggling had become weak. He stood crying, his fist lost in Lenny's paw. George shouted over and over, "Let go his hand, Lenny! Let go! Slim, come help me while the guy got any hand left." Suddenly Lenny let go his hold. He crouched, cowering against the wall. "You told me to, George," he said miserably. Curly sat down on the floor, looking in wonder at his crushed hand. Slim and Carlson bent over him. Then Slim straightened up and regarded Lenny with horror. "We got to get him to a doctor," he said. "It looked to me like every bone in his hand is bust." "I didn't want to," Lenny cried. "I didn't want to hurt him." Slim said, "Carlson, you get the candy wagon hitched up. We'll take him into Soledad and get him fixed up." Carlson hurried out. Slim turned to the whimpering Lenny. "It ain't your fault," he said. "This punk sure had it coming to him, but Jesus, he ain't hardly got no hand left." Slim hurried out, and in a moment returned with a tin cup of water. He held it to Curly's lips. George said, "Slim, will we get canned now? We need the steak. Will Curly's old man can us now?" Slim smiled wryly. He knelt down beside Curly. "You got your senses in hand enough to listen?" he asked. Curly nodded. "Well, then, listen," Slim went on. "I think you got your hand caught in a machine. If you don't tell nobody what happened, we ain't gonna. But you just tell and try to get this guy canned, and we'll tell everybody, and then will you get the laugh?" "I won't tell," said Curly. He avoided looking at Lenny. Buggy wheels sounded outside. Slim helped Curly up. "Come on now. Do. I told you nobody ought never to fight him." "No, I guess it was Candy I told." Candy nodded solemnly. "That's just what you done," he said. "Right this morning, when Curly first lit unto your friend, you says, 'He better not fool with Lenny. He knows what's good for him.' That's just what you says to me." George turned to Lenny. "It ain't your fault," he said. "You don't need to be scared no more. You done just what I told you to do. Maybe you better go in the washroom and clean up your face. You look like hell." Lenny smiled with his bruised mouth. "I didn't want no trouble," he said. He walked toward the door, but just before he came to it, he turned back. "George? What you want?" "I can still tend the rabbits, George." "Sure. You ain't done nothing wrong." "I didn't mean no harm, George." "Well, get the hell out and wash your face." Crooks, the Negro stable buck, had his bunk in the harness room, a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. On one side of the little room there was a square four-paned window, and on the other a narrow plank door leading into the barn. Crook's bunk was a long box filled with straw on which his blankets were flung. On the wall by the window there were pegs on which hung broken harness in process of being mended, strips of new leather, and under the window itself a little bench for leather-working tools, curved knives and needles, and balls of linen thread, and a small hand riveter. On pegs were also pieces of harness, a split collar with the horsehair stuffing sticking out, a broken hame, and a trace chain with its leather covering split. Crooks had his apple box over his bunk, and in it a range of medicine bottles, both for himself and for the horses. There were cans of saddle soap and a drippy can of tar with its paintbrush sticking over the edge. And scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions. For being alone, Crooks could leave his things about, and being a stable buck and a cripple, he was more permanent than the other men, and he'd accumulated more possessions than he could carry on his back. Crooks possessed several pairs of shoes, a pair of rubber boots, a big alarm clock, and a single-barreled shotgun. And he had books, too, a tattered dictionary and a mauled copy of the California Civil Code for 1905. There were battered magazines and a few dirty books on a special shelf over his bunk. A pair of large gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. This room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs. His body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and his eyes lay deep in his head, and because of their depth, seemed to glitter with intensity. His lean face was lined with deep black wrinkles, and he had thin, pain-tightened lips, which were lighter than his face. It was Saturday night. Through the open door that led into the barn came the sound of moving horses, of feet stirring, of teeth champing on hay, of the rattle of halter chains. In the stable buck's room, a small electric globe threw a meager yellow light. Crooks sat on his bunk. His shirt was out of his jeans in back. In one hand he held a bottle of liniment, and with the other he rubbed his spine. Now and then he poured a few drops of the liniment into his pink-palmed hand and reached up under his shirt to rub again. He flexed his muscles against his back and shivered. Noiselessly, Lenny appeared in the open doorway and stood there looking in, his big shoulders nearly filling the opening. For a moment Crooks didn't see him, but on raising his eyes he stiffened and a scowl came on his face. His hand came out from under his shirt. Lenny smiled helplessly in an attempt to make friends. Crooks said sharply, "You got no right to come in my room. This here's my room. Nobody got any right in here but me." Lenny gulped, and his smile grew more fawning. "Why, I ain't doing nothing," he said. "Just come to look at my puppy, and I seen your light," he explained. "Well, I got a right to have a light." "You go on, get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse, and you ain't wanted in my room." "Why ain't you wanted?" Lenny asked. "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play 'cause I'm black. They say I stink." "Well, I tell you, all of you stink to me." Lenny flapped his big hands helplessly. "Everybody went into town," he said. "Slim and George and everybody. George says I got to stay here and not get in no trouble. I seen your light." "Well, what do you want?" "Nothing. I seen your light. I thought I could just come in and sit." Crooks stared at Lenny, and he reached behind him and took down the spectacles and adjusted them over his pink ears and stared again. "I don't know what you're doing in the barn anyway," he complained. "You ain't no skinner. There's no call for a bucker to come into the barn at all. You ain't no skinner. You ain't got nothing to do with the horses." "The pup," Lenny repeated. "I come to see my pup." Well, go see your pup then. Don't come in a place where you're not wanted. Lenny lost his smile. He advanced to step into the room, then remembered and back to the door again. I looked at 'em a little. Slim says I ain't to pet 'em very much. Crook said, Well, you been taking 'em out of the nest all the time. I wonder the old lady don't move 'em someplace else. Oh, she don't care. She lets me. Lenny had moved into the room again. Crook scowled, but Lenny's disarming smile defeated him. Come on in and sit a while, Crook said. As long as you won't get out and leave me alone, you might as well sit down. His tone was a little more friendly. All the boys gone into town, huh? All but old Candy. He just sits in the bunkhouse sharpening his pencil and sharpening and figuring. Crooks adjusted his glasses. Figuring? What's Candy figuring about? Lenny almost shouted. About the rabbits. You're nuts, said Crooks. You're crazy as a wedge. What rabbits you talking about? The rabbits we're going to get, and I get to tend them, cut grass, and give 'em water and like that. Just nuts, said Crooks. I don't blame the guy you travel with for keeping you out of sight. Lenny said quietly, It ain't no lie. We're going to do it. Going to get a little place and live on the fat of the land. Crook settled himself more comfortably on his bunk. Sit down, he invited. Sit down on the nail keg. Lenny hunched down on the little barrel. You think it's a lie, Lenny said, but it ain't no lie. Every word's the truth, and you can just ask George. Crooks put his dark chin into his pink palm. You travel around with George, don't you? Sure. Me and him goes every place together. Crooks continued. Sometimes he talks and you don't know what the hell he's talking about. Ain't that so? He leaned forward, boring Lenny with his deep eyes. Ain't that so? Yeah, sometimes. Just talks on, and you don't know what the hell it's all about. Yeah, sometimes, but not always. Crooks leaned forward over the edge of the bunk. I ain't a southern Negro, he said. I was born right here in California. My old man had a chicken ranch, about 10 acres. The white kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I went to play with them, and some of 'em was pretty nice. My old man didn't like that. I never knew till long later why he didn't like that, but I know now. He hesitated, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. There wasn't another colored family for miles around. Now there ain't a colored man on this ranch, and there's just one family in Soledad. He laughed. If I say something, why, it's just a nigger saying it. Lenny asked, How long you think it'll be before them pups will be old enough to pet? Crooks laughed again. A guy can talk to you and be sure you won't go blabbing. Couple weeks and them pups will be all right. George knows what he's about. Just talks and you don't understand nothing. He leaned forward excitedly. This is just a nigger talking, and a busted back nigger, so it don't mean nothing, see? You couldn't remember it anyways. I seen it over and over. A guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference if he don't hear or understand. The thing is, they talking. Or they're sitting still, not talking. It don't make no difference. No difference. His excitement had increased until he pounded his knee with his hand. George can tell you screwy things, and it don't matter. It's just a talking. It's just being with another guy. That's all. He paused. His voice grew soft and persuasive. Suppose George don't come back no more. Suppose he took a powder and just ain't coming back. What'll you do then? Lenny's attention came gradually to what had been said. What? He demanded. I said, suppose George went into town tonight and you never heard of him no more. Crooks pressed forward some kind of private victory. Just suppose that, he repeated. He won't do it, Lenny cried. George wouldn't do nothing like that. I've been with George a long time. He'll come back tonight. But the doubt was too much for him. Don't you think he will? Crook's face lighted with pleasure in his torture. Nobody can't tell what a guy'll do, he observed calmly. Let's say he wants to come back and can't. Suppose he gets killed or hurt, so he can't come back. Lenny struggled to understand. George won't do nothing like that, he repeated. George is careful. He won't get hurt. He ain't never been hurt 'cause he's careful. Well, suppose, just suppose he don't come back. What'll you do then? Lenny's face wrinkled with apprehension. I don't know. Say, what are you doing anyways? He cried. This ain't true. George ain't got hurt. Crooks bored in on him. Want me to tell you what'll happen? They'll take you to the booby hatch. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog. Suddenly Lenny's eyes centered and grew quiet and mad. He stood up and walked dangerously toward Crooks. Who hurt George? He demanded. Crooks saw the danger as it approached him. He edged back on his bunk to get out of the way. I was just supposing, he said. George ain't hurt. He's all right. He'll be back all right. Lenny stood over him. What you supposing for? Ain't nobody gonna suppose no hurt to George. Crooks removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with his fingers. Just sit down, he said. George ain't hurt. Lenny growled back to his seat on the nail keg. Ain't nobody gonna talk no hurt to George, he grumbled. Crooks said gently, maybe you can see now. You got George. You know he's gonna come back. Suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy 'cause you was black. How'd you like that? Suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure, you could play horseshoes till it got dark. But then you got to read books. Books ain't no good. A guy needs somebody to be near him. He whined, a guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't make no difference who the guy is, long as he's with you. I tell you, he cried, I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. George gonna come back, Lenny reassured himself in a frightened voice. Maybe George come back already. Maybe I better go see. Crook said, I didn't mean to scare you. He'll come back. I was talking about myself. Guy sits alone out here at night, maybe reading books or thinking or stuff like that. Sometimes he gets thinking, and he got nothing to tell him what's so and what ain't so. Maybe if he sees something, he don't know whether it's right or not. He can't turn to some other guy and ask him if he sees it too. He can't tell. He got nothing to measure by. I seen things out here. I wasn't drunk. I don't know if I was asleep. If some guy was with me, he could tell me I was asleep, and then it would be all right. But I just don't know. Crooks was looking across the room now, looking toward the window. Lenny said miserably, "George wouldn't go away and leave me. I know George wouldn't do that." The stable buck went on dreamily. "I remember when I was a little kid on my old man's chicken ranch. Had 2 brothers. They was always near me, always there. Used to sleep right in the same room, right in the same bed, all 3. Had a strawberry patch, had an alfalfa patch. Used to turn the chickens out in the alfalfa on a sunny morning. My brothers would sit on a fence rail and watch 'em. White chickens, they was." Gradually, Lenny's interest came around to what was being said. "George says we're going to have alfalfa for the rabbits." "What rabbits?" "We're going to have rabbits and a berry patch." "You're nuts." "We are too. You ask George." "You're nuts." Crooks was scornful. "I seen hundreds of men come by on the road and on the ranches with their bindles on their back and that same damn thing in their heads. Hundreds of 'em. They come and they quit and go on, and every damn one of 'em's got a little piece of land in his head. And never a goddamn one of 'em ever gets it. Just like heaven. Everybody wants a little piece of land. I read plenty of books out here. Nobody never gets to heaven, and nobody gets no land. It's just in their head. They all the time talking about it, but it's just in their head." He paused and looked toward the open door, for the horses were moving restlessly and the halter chains clinked. A horse whinnied. "I guess somebody's out there," Crook said. "Maybe Slim. Slim comes in sometimes 2-3 times a night. Slim's a real skinner. He looks out for his team." He pulled himself painfully upright and moved toward the door. "That you, Slim?" he called. Candy's voice answered. "Slim went in town. Say, you seen Lenny?" "You mean the big guy?" "Yeah. Seen him around any place?" "He's in here," Crook said shortly. He went back to his bunk and lay down. Candy stood in the doorway, scratching his bald wrist and looking blindly into the lighted room. He made no attempt to enter. "Tell you what, Lenny, I've been figuring out about them rabbits," Crook said irritably. "You can come in if you want." Candy seemed embarrassed. "I don't know. 'Course if you want me to." "Come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might just as well." It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. Candy came in, but he was still embarrassed. "You got a nice, cozy little place in here," he said to Crooks. "Must be nice to have a room all to yourself this way." "Sure," said Crooks. "And the manure pile under the window." "Sure, it's swell." Lenny broke in. You said about them rabbits? Candy leaned against the wall beside the broken collar while he scratched the wrist stump. I've been here a long time, he said. And Crook's been here a long time. This is the first time I ever been in his room. Crook said darkly. Guys don't come into a colored man's room very much. Nobody been here but Slim. Slim and the boss. Candy quickly changed the subject. Slim's as good a Skinner as I ever seen. Lenny leaned toward the old swamper. About them rabbits, he insisted. Candy smiled. I got it figured out. We can make some money on them rabbits if we go about it right. But I get to tend 'em, Lenny broke in. George says I get to tend 'em. He promised. Crooks interrupted brutally. You guys are just kidding yourself. You'll talk about it a hell of a lot, but you won't get no land. You'll be a swamper here till they take you out in a box. Hell, I've seen too many guys. Lenny here'll quit and be on the road in 2-3 weeks. Seems like every guy got land in his head. Candy rubbed his cheek angrily. You're goddamn right we're going to do it. George says we are. We got the money right now. Yeah, said Crooks. And where's George now? In town in a whorehouse. That's where your money's going. Jesus. I've seen it happen too many times. I've seen too many guys with land in their head. They never get none under their hand. Candy cried. Sure, they all want it. Everybody wants a little bit of land. Not much. Something he could live on, and there couldn't nobody throw him off of it. I never had none. I planted crops for damn near everybody in this state, but they wasn't my crops, and when I harvested 'em, it wasn't none of my harvest. But we're going to do it now. And don't make no mistake about that. George ain't got the money in town. That money's in the bank. Me and Lenny and George, we're going to have a room to ourselves. We're going to have a dog and rabbits and chickens. We're going to have green corn and maybe a cow or a goat. He stopped, overwhelmed with his picture. Crooks asked, You say you got the money? Damn right. We got most of it. Just a little bit more to get. Have it all in 1 month. George got the land all picked out, too. Crooks reached around and explored his spine with his hand. I never seen a guy really do it, he said. I seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land, but every time a whorehouse or a blackjack game took what it takes. He hesitated. If you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, well, I'd come and lend a hand. I ain't so crippled I can't work like a sumbitch if I want to. Any of you boys seen Curly? They swung their heads toward the door. Looking in was Curly's wife. Her face was heavily made up. Her lips were slightly parted. She breathed strongly as though she'd been running. Curly ain't been here, Candy said sourly. She stood still in the doorway, smiling a little at them, rubbing the nails of one hand with the thumb and forefinger of the other, and her eyes traveled from one face to another. They left all the weak ones here, she said finally. Think I don't know where they all went? Even Curly? I know where they all went. Lenny watched her, fascinated. But Candy and Crooks were scowling down away from her eyes. Candy said, "Then if you know, why you won't ask us where Curly's at?" She regarded them amusedly. "Funny thing," she said. "If I catch any one man and he's alone, I get along fine with him. But just let two of the guys get together and you won't talk. Just nothing but mad." She dropped her fingers and put her hands on her hips. "You're all scared of each other, that's what. Every one of you's scared the rest is going to get something on you." After a pause, Crooks said, "Maybe you better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble." "Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. Think I don't like to talk to somebody once in a while? Think I like to stick in that house all the time?" Candy laid the stump of his wrist on his knee and rubbed it gently with his hand. He said accusingly, "You got a husband. You got no call fooling around with other guys causing trouble." The girl flared up. "Sure, I got a husband. Y'all seen him. Swell guy, ain't he? Spends all his time saying what he's gonna do to guys he don't like, and he don't like nobody. Think I'm gonna stay in that 2x4 house and listen how Curly's gonna lead with his left twice and then bring in the old right cross? 1-2, he says. Just the old 1-2, and he'll go down." She paused, and her face lost its sullenness and grew interested. "Say, what happened to Curly's hand?" There was an embarrassed silence. Candy stole a look at Lenny. Then he coughed. "Why, Curly, he got his hand caught in a machine, ma'am. Bust his hand." She watched for a moment, then she laughed. "Baloney. What you think you're selling me? Curly started something he didn't finish. Caught in a machine. Baloney. Why, he ain't give nobody the good old 1-2 since he got his hand bust." "Who bust him?" Candy repeated sullenly. "Got it caught in a machine." "All right," she said contemptuously. "All right, cover 'em up if you wanna. What do I care? You bindle bums think you're so damn good. What do you think I am, kid? I tell you, I could have went with shows, not just one neither. And the guy told me he could put me in pictures." She was breathless with indignation. "Saturday night, everybody out doing something. Everybody. And what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs, a nigger and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep, and liking it because ain't nobody else." Lenny watched her, his mouth half open. Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity of the Negro. But a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backward. "I had enough," he said angrily. "You ain't wanted to hear. We told you ain't. And I tell you, you got floozy ideas about what us guys amounts to. You ain't got sense enough in that chicken head to even see that we ain't stiffs. Suppose you get us canned. Suppose you do. You think we'll hit the highway and look for another lousy two-bit job like this? You don't know that we got our own ranch to go to and our own house. We ain't got to stay here. We got a house and chickens and fruit trees and a place 100 times prettier than this, and we got friends. That's what we got. Maybe there was a time when we was scared of getting canned, but we ain't no more. We got our own land, and it's ours, and we can go to it." Curly's wife laughed at him. "Baloney," she said. "I seen too many of you guys. If you had 2 bits in the world, why, you'd be in getting 2 shots of corn with it and sucking the bottom of the glass. I know you guys. Candy's face had grown redder and redder, but before she was done speaking, he had control of himself. He was the master of the situation. I might have knew, he said gently. Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. We know what we got, and we don't care whether you know it or not. So maybe you better just scatter along now, 'cause Curly maybe ain't gonna like his wife out in the barn with us bindle stiffs. She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her. And she looked longest at Lenny until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly she said, "Where'd you get them bruises on your face?" Lenny looked up guiltily. Who? Me? Yeah, you. Lenny looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. He got his hand caught in a machine, he said. Curly's wife laughed. Okay, machine. I'll talk to you later. I like machines. Candy broke in. You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with him. I won't tell George what you says. George won't have you messing with Lenny. Who's George? She asked. The little guy you come with? Lenny smiled happily. That's him, he said. That's the guy, and he's gonna let me tend the rabbits. Well, if that's all you want, I might get a couple rabbits myself. Crook stood up from his bunk and faced her. I had enough, he said coldly. You got no rights coming in the colored man's room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. Now you just get out, and get out quick. If you don't, I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more. She turned on him in scorn. Listen, nigger, she said, you know what I can do to you if you open your trap? Crook stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. She closed on him. You know what I could do? Crook seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. Yes, ma'am. Well, you keep your place in, nigger. I could get you strung up in a tree so easy it ain't even funny. Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, Yes, ma'am. And his voice was toneless. For a moment she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. But Crook sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. She turned at last to the other two. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. If you was to do that, we'd tell, he said quietly. We'd tell about you framing crooks. Tell and be damned, she cried. Nobody'd listen to you, and you know it. Nobody'd listen to you. Candy subsided. No, he agreed. Nobody'd listen to us. Lenny whined. I wish George was here. I wish George was here. Candy stepped over to him. Don't you worry none, he said. I just heard the guys coming in. George will be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet. He turned to Curly's wife. You better go home now, he said quietly. If you go right now, we won't tell Curly was here. She She appraised him coolly. "I ain't sure you heard nothing." "Better not take no chances," he said. "If you ain't sure, you better take the safe way." She turned to Lenny. "I'm glad you bust up Curly a little bit. He got it coming to him. Sometimes I'd like to bust him myself." She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, and some horses snorted, and some stamped their feet. Crooks seemed to come slowly out of the layers of protection he had put on. "Was that the truth, what you said about the guys come back?" he asked. "Sure. I heard them." "Well, I didn't hear nothing." "The gate banged," Candy said, and he went on. "Jesus Christ, Curly's wife can move quiet. I guess she's had a lot of practice, though." Crooks avoided the whole subject now. "Maybe you guys better go," he said. "I ain't sure I want you in here no more. A colored man gotta have some rights, even if he don't like 'em." Candy said, "That bitch didn't ought to have said that to you." "Wasn't nothing," Crooks said dully. "You guys coming in and sitting made me forget. What she says is true." The horses snorted out in the barn, and the chains rang, and a voice called, "Lenny? Oh, Lenny, you in the barn?" "It's George," Lenny cried, and he answered, "Here, George, I'm right in here." In a second, George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. "What you doing in Crook's room? You hadn't ought to be in here." Crooks nodded. "I told 'em, but they come in anyways." "Well, why'n't you kick 'em out?" "I didn't care much," said Crooks. "Lenny's a nice fellow." Now Candy aroused himself. "Oh, George, I've been figuring and figuring. I got it doped out how we can even make some money on them rabbits." George scowled. "I thought I told you not to tell nobody about that." Candy was crestfallen. "Didn't tell nobody but Crooks." George said, "Well, you guys get out of here. Jesus, seems like I can't go away for a minute." Candy and Lenny stood up and went toward the door. Crooks called, "Candy." "Huh?" "Remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs?" "Yeah," said Candy, "I remember." "Well, just forget it," said Crooks. "I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that." "Well, okay, if you feel like that. Good night." The three men went out of the door. As they went through the barn, the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat on his bunk and looked at the door for a moment, and then he reached for the liniment bottle. He pulled out his shirt and back, poured a little liniment in his pink palm, and reaching around, he fell slowly to rubbing his back.
This ends Disc 3.